All right. Well, good morning, church. How are you guys doing today? Everybody excited to be here? Awesome. Good. Hey, this feels a little weird because you guys are like top heavy over on this side. So I feel like either all you guys need to move to this side and I can go here, or you guys need to spread out. But we'll work through it. We're good. Okay. Hey, super excited as we're continuing in our series called The Armor of God. And this is a great series. It's a great reminder of some things. And here's what I love about this. Paul writes this beautiful letter for us in Ephesians. He's writing it to the churches around Ephesus. And it's a very positive and encouraging and uplifting letter. But then he gets to the end. And I love how he wraps this up with what we are in for this series, The Armor of God. Because what Paul is basically telling us, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you're exempt from pain. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you're exempt from difficulties or hardship in life. Yes, in fact, you're going to experience those things. You don't get a pass just because, you're a Christian. You don't get to punch your card to a hassle-free, stress-free life. Things are going to come at you. And I love what he says here because essentially in this passage, what he's telling us through the entire passages, 10 through 17, the verses that we've been looking at, he's like not only are things going to come at you, but here's how you need to handle them. He's going to give us a roadmap for how we need to handle these things that are going to be coming at us. And don't forget, when Paul is writing this, he's writing this from prison. Dude's in prison in Rome. So he knows a little something about suffering and a little something about pain, right? Because he's sitting there and he's got this letter and he's trying to wrap it up. And he's watching these Roman guards, these Roman soldiers that are walking by him daily. And they're in their full kit, they're in their full armor. And he's like, how can I wrap this up in a way that gives a visual to the readers so that they can understand what it is I'm saying? So he's like, hey, I'm going to use the armor that these Roman soldiers are wearing, and I'm going to connect them to something from God that will help you in your fight against the enemy. And that's what he does in this passage. And so for those that haven't been with us, let me just give us a quick recap. It started in verse 10. And in verse 10, what Paul does is he tells us where our identity and our source of our strength comes from. He's going to say, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. So that's foundational for us because what Paul is saying is our strength doesn't come from within. Our strength doesn't come from our own accomplishments. No, he says our strength comes from God. It comes from the name of the Lord and it comes from his strength. Our strength, we tap into his strength. And that's critical, that's foundational for us because quite frankly, for a lot of people who are very successful in life, this is why they maybe struggle with their faith just a little bit. Because they have made their way through life and they've been very successful on their own accord. They're like, hey, I've done all this on my own. Pretty good guy. I can do this. But then when it comes to faith, they want to carry that over and they're like, oh, well, I can do faith my way and I can earn it and I can do it. But what Paul's saying is that's not the case. You have to tap into the strength of God if you're going to do it. And that's where our source of our strength comes from, is from God. Verse 11, he's going to say how we tap into God's strength. He's going to tell us that we put on the whole armor of God. And it's not just parts of it, it's the whole thing. We have to put on the whole armor of God. So we have to put on God's armor. And in verse 12, he's going to keep going. He's going to tell us why we need to be strong. He's going to tell us why we need to do this, why we need to put on the whole armor of God. Because what he's saying is look, there's a cosmic war, an invisible war that's happening and raging all around you. Whether you realize it or not, there is an unseen realm that's affecting your seen realm. There's a cosmic war, and yeah, your battle is not against flesh and blood. He's going to say, yeah, your fight is not against other people, even though sometimes it feels that way. But there's an invisible enemy out there with his demons, and they're coming at you, and that's who you're going to fight. And you have to acknowledge this. We have to acknowledge that there's this cosmic war that's fighting, going all around us, because if not, we said this before, it's like being sucker punched. Like that's the beauty of a sucker punch. You don't know where it's coming from or when it's coming. And if you don't at least acknowledge that there's this war that's raging around us, it's like you're getting sucker punched every day. You wake up in the morning, boom, you're punched in the face. You get in your car to go to work, boom, you're punched in the face. You get to work, you're boom, punched in the face. You come home, boom. It's like you just keep getting punched over and over and over, but you don't realize where the punch is coming from because you don't at least acknowledge that there's this cosmic war that's happening all around us. And then verse 13, he's going to tell us how we're going to fight this fight. Paul uses this term over and over. He says you're to stand firm. And that word stand firm, it's like taking up a fighting stance, right? You have to take up a fighting stance, and it means you got to hold the line. That's what we said in week 2. We said you got to hold the line against the enemy because the enemy is going to be barreling at you with everything he's got. So we have to hold the line to protect our children. We have to hold the line to protect our families. We have to hold the line to protect our communities. We have to hold the line to protect our hearts. And that's exactly how we're going to fight this fight, with the armor of God. And so then in verse 14 and 15, he begins to explain the armor. He takes, the piece of armor and he connects it to something with God. And we saw that in the last couple of weeks in verses 14 and 15. Now, I don't know if you're like me, if you're a little bit of a grammar nerd or like a language nerd, but there's something that's going on here that you may have missed, or maybe you picked up on it. But when Paul starts explaining the armor of God, there's 2 categories that he basically bends them into. So you got the first 3 pieces of armor, right? Remember what they were? There was the belt, there was the breastplate, and there was the shoes, right? And what Paul tells us is we have to put on the belt. We have to put on the breastplate. We have to put on the shoes because they're like pieces of clothing. And when he says put on, what that means is that we should be wearing this stuff at all times. But now we're going to shift and we're going to hit the last 3 for the next 3 weeks. And he doesn't tell us to put on these things. He's going to tell us to take up. He's going to tell us to take up the shield. We're going to take up the helmet. We're going to take up the sword. And what he's saying when he says that, when he says take up, he's like, look, the battles are ensuing. The war is raging around us and it's coming at you. So when it comes at you, you better take these things up because you're going to need them when the battle's coming straight at you. And so that brings us to our passage today. So we're going to jump in with this. Let's look at it's Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 16. It's actually one verse, and it's this. He says, in all circumstances. I love how he starts that out because he's saying, anytime the enemy's coming at you, every single time you're under attack, in all circumstances, he tells us to take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish the flaming darts of the evil one. And I love that because we get that connection right there. You got the Roman shield and you've got faith. And he's basically connecting these 2 things together. So let's kind of unpack what those mean. Let's start with the Roman shield. The Roman shield in the first century was a Greek word called scutum, and I get it. Funny sounding word for a very effective piece of armor, right? But it was a Roman shield was essentially this. There's a picture of it here. It was about 4 feet tall, about 2.5 feet wide. It would have been made completely of wood. They would have basically like plywood almost. They would have fastened the wood together in such a way that it made a curve. And then they would have glued it together. And then around the frame of it, they would have put metal to kind of fasten it and hold it together, right? And this would have been the Roman soldiers' first line of defense in a battle, in an attack. And here's the cool thing about it. Because in that day, one of the primary techniques of battle was the use of archers and arrows. So what would happen is these two formations would come at each other, and in the first line would be your foot soldiers, right? You'd have all your foot soldiers with their weapons, they're ready to go into battle, but directly behind them would be a row of archers. And what most of the archers would do is they would have their arrows, they would dip the tip of them into tar, and then they would light them on fire, and then at the same time they would send a barrage of arrows into the enemy. Now here's how the Roman soldiers got around that. They would take like leather hide or cloth, they would wrap it around their shield, and before they went into battle they would soak it in water. And the reason they did this was because when those flaming arrows came at them, and even if it stuck into their shield, the wet hide would extinguish those arrows. And no doubt that's exactly what Paul has in mind when he tells us right here that you're going to extinguish the flaming darts of the evil one. That's the technique that he has here. So we have to understand that this shield was the first line of defense against the enemy. It was the Roman soldiers' first line of defense in any battle, in any attack. But then he connects it to this word faith. So we have to understand that the reality is we all have faith, right? Like, truthfully, even an atheist has faith in something. So the question isn't, do you have faith? The question is, what or who do you have faith in? Like, where are you applying your faith? And more importantly, are you applying your faith correctly? And that's what we're going to look at for the rest of our time this morning. And for us, I think there are two ways when we talk about this idea of faith. I think there's two ways we as a church and we as Christians can get this sideways, okay? And I just want to share those with you and talk about some of the dangers that are associated with each of those. The first thing is this: we don't fully understand what is meant by biblical faith. Like, we have an idea, for most of us, we have a good grasp and the concept of what faith means. But I think for some of us that struggle with this, we don't have a full understanding of what it means to have a biblical faith. Now, the word faith comes from the Greek word pistis or pistuo, and it means belief or trust or confidence. And we see that play out if we go back just a few chapters in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, in chapter 2, this is what Paul says. He says, starting in verse 8, "For by grace you have been saved through faith." There's our word, pistis. "And this is not of your own doing. It is of the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." So what Paul is saying here is that your salvation, my salvation, has nothing to do with the things that we have accomplished in life. Has nothing to do with the things of our works, of our good deeds, anything we've done. We have not earned it in any way. It is a free gift from God for us. And the way we come to it is by faith, through belief, through confidence, through trust. But when he says this, he's not just talking about like an intellectual affirmation. You guys get that? Like, this is not just like, oh yeah, I acknowledge who Jesus is and what Jesus did. That's not what this is about. There's more to this idea of faith than simply an intellectual affirmation of a truth. What he's going to say is, pistis actually has a further meaning. Yes, it means belief and trust and confidence, but it also means faithfulness, and it means fidelity. And we see that if you keep going in verse 10 of this same one. So in verse 8, he says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, through your belief." You go to verse 10, he says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." So what he's essentially telling us here is that, yes, you have to have a belief in something that is true. You have to have a belief in Jesus. But faith is not simply believing in who Jesus was or what Jesus did. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that true faith in Jesus prompts a response. Like if you're going to have true faith in who Jesus was, it has to evoke or elicit a response from us. And that response is faithfulness, is essentially what he's saying. When he talks about, we should walk in them, the works that we should walk in, he's talking about walking in faithfulness. So if we put this in other words, what he's essentially saying is like, we are called to walk out our faith in faithfulness. Like, it's not just enough to believe something, you've got to respond and let it carry you forward in your life. So when Paul says, take up your shield, what he's telling us is your shield, my shield, is found in faithful obedience to who Jesus is and what Jesus did. So in other words, if you're going to sit there and say, yes, I believe that Jesus is my Savior, well, then you have to respond accordingly. And you have to live out a life of humble gratitude for what he did on the cross for us. And if you're going to say, yes, I have faith, I believe that Jesus is the Lord of my life, well, then you better live a life of submission to his authority. It's not enough to simply say, I believe these things. You have to follow through with it in how you live out your life. See, in the Greek culture back then, it was very much accepted for you to believe something and live a life completely different. Like you could believe this thing was true, but then you could live your life completely separate from that, not in line with that, and that was okay. That's just how the Greek culture was. But in the Hebraic mindset, in the Christian mindset today, those things cannot be divorced from each other. If you're gonna say, I believe or I have faith in this, then it has to evoke a response in how you live it out in your life. The faithfulness in the way you live it out. And what the Hebrews would say back then in the first century is like, okay, if your faith walk doesn't match what you're saying you believe in, then maybe you didn't believe it in the first place. You know what I'm saying? So like it's like we say sometimes here, it's like you don't truly know what you believe in until it's put to the test. You know what I'm saying? You can say you believe in this and this and this, but when push comes to shove, when it hits home personally for you, do you kind of cower away from it, or do you lean into it? Do you hold on to that thing that you're saying you have faith in? And that's what Paul is saying when he says, take up this shield of faith. So the reality is, when he says this, we have to take this faith that we claim to have, and we have to live it out in our lives daily. And this is a theme all throughout Scripture. There's a reason in 2 Corinthians, Paul writes, we walk by faith, not by sight. And James, in his letter, he writes that faith without works is dead. That's what he means. He's saying, like, it's one thing to say you have faith in something, but if you're not faithful to walking it out, then it's not what you think it is. It doesn't mean what you think it means. And here's the danger with that. The reality is, we live in South Carolina. We're like in the Bible Belt, right? We're like literally the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. And because of that, we live in a very Christian culture. And I have conversations with people. I had a conversation with a guy a few years ago, and we somehow got talking about salvation and faith and different things like that. And he said, oh, yeah, I'm a Christian. I'm a member of this church. As if somehow having your name on a roll makes you a Christian. He's like, no. I was raised in this church. I never missed VBS. I never missed Sunday school. My parents are buried out in the grave out here. I was married in this church. As if somehow that's the basis for salvation. But Paul tells us in Ephesians 2 that it's not. That salvation is a gift from God by grace through faith. And so we have to understand that. And I think sometimes when we live in a culture that's just kind of engrossed in this idea of Christian culture, it's easy to always just assume we're saved, right? We just assume like, oh yeah, I've been saved. I've got salvation because I was just raised in it. But that's not what Paul's saying here. We have to understand that what faith is and what it means in our life and how we walk it out daily. Now, the other problem here, the other way we can get this concept of faith sideways is this. If we orient our faith to the wrong thing, right? It doesn't matter how sincere your faith is. If your faith is pointing you to the wrong thing, then it doesn't mean anything. Like, you can have the most sincerest faith in the world, but if it's the wrong thing to have your faith in, then it's for nothing. The object of our faith matters. And the object of our faith is not a feeling. It's not an idea. It's not even an action or a concept. Our faith is found in a person, and that person is Jesus Christ. It's in the work that he did going to the cross for us. It's the work that he did by walking out of that tomb. So it's very possible for us to have faith, but have faith in the wrong thing. And so if you're going back a few years, when I was in seminary, there were two books that profoundly shaped my understanding of this concept of faith, and more specifically, how the church and how we as a church have over time handled it. There's an author, he was a guy named Christian Smith. He's actually a sociologist. He worked at Notre Dame. And so he did a 5-year study on teenagers who proclaimed to have a faith. They were raised in the church, raised with this idea of faith. And so what he did was over 5 years, there were like hundreds, if not thousands of kids that he did interviews with. He observed their faith. He looked at how life came at them, how life challenged them, gave them some ups and downs. And so he just observed them, right? And he wrote this book called Soul Searching based on his results. And then a few years later, as a follow-up to this, he actually began doing interviews with a lot of the teenagers that he originally had studied. And now they're young adults, like in their early to mid-20s. And so he starts having some interviews to see where they are with their faith. And his follow-up book was called Souls in Transition. And here's what he came up with. This was basically what he had observed. He said that by and large, what most of these teenagers and now young adults have done is they've moved away from this idea of biblical faith, this idea that Jesus is our eternal King, that we submit everything to him, that we follow after him, that he is our Lord and Savior. They've moved away from this biblical faith to what he called, and he coined this phrase, moralistic, therapeutic deism. Deism means that, yeah, there's some supernatural sprinkled in, right? A deist is someone who believes, yes, there is a God, but essentially God is very far, very distant from us. Essentially, God took the universe. Yes, he created the universe. It's like a clock that he wound up and he set it here and then he stepped away and he's not involved anymore. But we know that God is actively involved in our lives every day. And he said moralistic. Moralistic meaning that central to us having a good and happy life means we have to do some moral deeds. So in other words, very legalistic, like there's a set of rules that we have to follow if we want to achieve a happy life. And so the last piece of this was what we call therapeutic. Therapeutic meaning, what do I get out of it? Like, okay, I'm going to have faith in God. I'm going to have faith in Jesus, but I need to see what I'm getting out of this. It's almost treating Jesus like a genie in the bottle, right? It's like, I'm going to have faith in Jesus as long as I'm getting the blessings I think I deserve. I'm going to have faith in Jesus as long as he's doing the things that I want him to. And you guys have heard me say this before. Jesus is nobody's errand boy. That is not why he is here. And we have to understand that. So what they essentially said is like they believe that there's a God, that God kind of got things going. He's hands off, and that we just have to do some things and live a good life and a good moral life. And I'm going to continue to give my faith to him as long as I'm getting out of it what I think I deserve. Now, this shows up mostly in our felt needs. When we talk about this idea of therapeutic, that like what we get out of it, it shows up in our felt needs. It's like, if God will just fill in the blank, then I will respond. If God will just heal me and give me a good, doctor's report, then I will. Or if God will reconcile this relationship with me, then I will. You see what I'm saying? You see how that works? It's like this if-then relationship. But that's not how it works. Like somehow if God will just do the things that I expect him to do and respond the way I want him to, then I will reward God with my faith. But there's a passage that addresses this in John. John chapter 2, there's 3 verses 23 through 25. And this is Jesus. It says this. It says, now when he, that's Jesus, was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and he needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. So let me kind of unpack this a little bit. That word entrust, when it says that he did not entrust himself to them, entrust is the same root pistuo, pistis, that we're talking about with faith. So what happened was you have all these people that were seeing Jesus do all of these miracles, right? And what was happening is they began to put their faith in the miracles, not in the miracle worker. See, the thing I love about John's gospel, he never uses the word miracle. He always uses the word sign when he's describing a miracle. And Jesus did all these amazing miracles. He fed all of these people. He healed all kinds of infirmaries and sicknesses and problems, right? All these physical needs. He did all these things as miracles. But what John says is these were all signs. And what do signs do? They point to things, right? Like signs are meant to point to things. And in this case, when he does a miracle, it's a sign that points back to who he is, to his divinity, to the fact that he is God. But what was happening here in this passage, he's saying that these people became so obsessed with what Jesus was doing for them, they put their faith in the miracles, in the blessings that he was doing, rather than putting their faith in him. This is also where we get a lot of you've heard of the word of faith movement. This whole idea that if you just have enough faith and pray to God, God's going to give you everything that you want in life. Like you know what I'm saying? Like if I just have enough faith, God's going to heal me. If I just have enough faith, he's going to bless my businesses and it's going to grow. If I just have enough faith, then he's going to do this. And the trip here, the catch is, the loop here is that if you don't get the blessing you think you deserve, then it's because you didn't have enough faith, as if somehow you've done something to earn it. And that's not how blessings work, and that's not how faith works. And so, look, don't get me wrong, I'm all about the John 10:10 life. You know what I'm saying? Like John 10:10 says that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but Jesus says, but I come so that you may have life, and have life abundantly. Like, I'm all about the abundant life. But here's the danger. If you begin to put your faith in the abundant life, if you begin to put your faith in the blessings that Jesus gives you, well, what happens when Jesus chooses not to do that thing that you want him to do? What happens when he chooses not to heal the way you think he should heal? What happens when he chooses not to restore that relationship that you've been praying for months and months? What does that do to your faith? Because if your faith is not in him, and your faith is in what he's doing for you, then your faith is being misapplied. Now, I love how Paul does this. He links this idea of the shield and faith, but the question is why? Like, Paul could link anything to the shield, to that first line of defense. He could. He could link courage. He could say the shield of courage, or the shield of integrity, or whatever he wants. But he chooses the shield of faith, the shield of pisteuo. And I think the reason he does this is because in those days, the shield was never about individual purposes. It was never about individually what you're getting out of it. The shield was actually combined with other shields in a defensive tactic. And it was a defensive tactic that testudo. Testudo was a Latin word. It's where we get our modern day word tortoise. And essentially, this was a defensive tactic that the Roman formations would use when they were going into battle. So they're rolling into battle. You know, the enemy's getting ready to fire some arrows at them, and they go into this formation, and what they would do is the front line would take their shields and plant them in the ground, right, and create a front line barrier. And then the side flanks would literally take their shields and move them over here and plant them to the side, so they put another side barrier. And then all of the guys in the middle would pull their shields up over their heads, and they would interlace them and interlock them in a way that looked like a tortoise shell for the most part. But it was a very effective technique so that when these enemies came, as long as you were locked tight together, the enemy's arrows couldn't get through. It was a very, very effective defensive tactic that they used back in these days. And Paul was very much aware of this. And so what you get is this imagery here is of community, right? So we tend to think of our faith in terms of a singularly, like how it plays out in our life, and faithfulness and how it plays out in our life. But what he's saying here is that we're never meant to be isolated. We're never meant to be on our own in this fight. In these battles that we have that are waging against us, we're never meant to be on our own. Because the reality is, if you are in formation, if you're locked arms with fellow Christians, then you can withstand some of these arrows that are coming at you. But if you're on your own, if you're out there just isolated by yourself, you're a sitting duck. Like, that's what the enemy wants. That's how he's going to come at you. You're going to be vulnerable for attack when you do this. Now, here's the interesting thing. When we read this passage, verses 10 through 17, we tend to read this naturally as if it applies to us. But every single passage here is written in the plural. So if you read starting in verse 11, he says, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand. We read that you is referring to us individually, right? Separately. That's not what's happening in the Greek. If Paul was from the south, he would have said y'all. If Paul was from the north, he said yous guys. But that word in the Greek is a plural word when he says you. It's not a singular word. It's plural. Verse 12, he says, for we, again, plural, do not wrestle against flesh and blood. Verse 13 says that you, again, plural, may be able to withstand. And then in our verse today, it says, take up the shield of faith, which you, again, plural, can extinguish the flaming darts that come at you. And you guys get this. This is just common sense. This is logic. You are so much stronger when you are together in a group than when you are out singular by yourself. Who's ever watched the National Geographic documentaries and stuff just like for fun, right? Yeah, like when you see those videos, Jill hates these videos. I actually enjoy watching them. But what you have is you have like this lion who's like hanging out in the bushes and the trees and stuff, and he's like watching this pack of like zebras or whatever, and they're all together, huddled up together, and he's just watching. He's just prowling. He's just waiting. He's biding his time. He's just kind of waiting around. And then all of a sudden, they finish drinking, and the herd moves over this way. But then there's that one zebra that misses the mark that they're leaving. And so what happens is that's when the lion pounces. When that one zebra gets separated from the pack, when that one zebra is isolated from the rest, that's when he's most vulnerable, and that's when the lion's going to attack. And that's when the enemy attacks us, when we are separated from our fellow Christians, when we're separated from our faith walk. And so essentially what Paul is telling us here in this passage is, yes, you take up the shield of faith. He's going to describe it like this. In other words, he's going to say the shield of faithfulness. But the way we walk out our faithfulness, we faithfully walk out our faith in faith community. And I know that's a lot of faiths, but that's essentially what he's saying is like you live out your faith faithfully in faith community. Because we're meant to be together. And guys, I get it. Like it's difficult sometimes. You wake up in the morning and you want to come to church and you're like, man, things are just chaotic and crazy and you're yelling and your wife's yelling or whatever. And I'm describing me and Jill because usually it's my fault. Usually what happens is I've done something or said something that's triggered her and she's just there absorbing, trying to calm me down. But the reality is then you get to church and what happens? Things just calm. Like when you're together with your church family, it brings the edge off. And that's why we always push so hard for being like here, Sunday mornings, being together as part of a faith community, worshiping God together. That's why we do our midweek connects. We invite you guys to come into our midweek connects on Wednesdays because it's just a chance not just to learn something, but it's a chance to experience community. And it's more than just these formal things, these formal settings that we provide opportunities for. Like you need to be involved with other Christians on a regular basis. And it doesn't have to be anything like formal. It doesn't have to be a Bible study. Like go get coffee with a fellow Christian and just talk about your day. Talk about your week, the things that are bugging you, the things that you're struggling with. And you bounce off each other. You know what I'm saying? Like go to lunch together. Go play a round of golf together. Go fish together. Do whatever your thing is. Find a couple of Christians that you can lock arms with and you just do life together. I know that expression gets overplayed a lot in the church, but the reality is we're never meant to live life alone. We're meant to live life in community with other Christians. So find ways to connect with other Christians. Find ways to lock arms with them. So as we wrap up today, I just have one question for us. And the question is this: who are your testudo people? Who are the people that you're going to be in a formation with? Who are the people that when the enemy starts shooting these flaming arrows at you, that you're going to be able to throw your shields up and interweave your shields to protect the whole group? Who are those people? Who are you linking arms with when things get difficult? Who are the people that in the middle of the night, you can call them at 2 a.m. when you're struggling and you need help? Who are those people? Because you need them in your life. We all need them in our lives. And the thing is about it, you can't wait until the attack's coming to try to figure out who those people are. You better figure them out right now. Because the reality is, the thing that I know about all of you, because it's true about me too, you are either coming out of a bad situation, you're currently in a bad situation, or you're about to go into a bad situation. It's just the reality of life. Like you're going to walk through struggles. You're going to walk through difficult times. Yes, there are going to be times where things are going awesome, but the reality is we're all going to face difficult times. So you better figure out who your testudo people are before you go into that so that you can lock arms with them, so that you can rely on them. Taking up the shield of faith, living out your faith in faithful obedience, surrounded by genuine community. That's what Paul is saying when he talks about taking up the shield of faith, taking up the shield of faithfulness. That's how we do this together. Let me pray for us.